Long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the
Welcome to The Politics Guys. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by Justin Holmes, a professor of political science at the University of Northern Iowa. Justin, welcome to the show.
Morning, Trey.
It's always a lot of fun to get to do this with you. Just a heads up for listeners, I am not 100% this week, and so if I sound a little bit funny, we were talking about this before the show, it's probably just a little bit of snot that's going on. You can say that on the radio, right? You know,
I believe as doctors we should say mucus, but I guess we're
that's
not that
true.
kind of doctor,
Mucus suppressant. That's fair. That's fair. Well, Justin, we actually had to kind of narrow things down this week. We had to decide what we were going to tackle among a number of things that could be tackled, but it seemed that we had to start in my childhood state of Kentucky. Now, I've been saying for a while that, and I've gotten pushback on this, that the Republican Party is the MAGA party. And I don't mean just the last few months or the last year. I've said this, well, forever and a day. As a matter of fact, I got it outed from working. This is a true story. I got outed from working as a Republican in Florida after coming out against Trump the very early first time. And I've continued to argue since then that Republicans aren't conservatives. They're MAGA populists. But I'll get your take on that right now. But why are we talking about this? We're talking about this because after 14 years in office, Thomas Massie in Kentucky got overturned. A man who had a national reputation as being safe despite only, I put that kind of in quotation marks, with Trump about 90 to 91% of the time, was soundly defeated by Trump-backed challenger Ed Galbraith. And again, just to put this in perspective for listeners, we're talking about the most expensive House primary in American history. Trump-aligned super PACs poured $7 million into the race, as Massie was pointing out, and pro-Israel groups put in another $9 million into the race. And in some ways, this gets seen as being a bit of a civil war in the Republican Party, but I think there's a clear winner, and I think it's been for a long time. It's Trump. Now, Justin, I don't want to just talk about Massie, of course. I see that as pivotal, but outside the bluegrass state, we also had Louisiana outing Senator Bill Cassidy, the last remaining individual who voted to convict Trump during his second impeachment. He lost his seat to yet another Trump-picked challenger, but he didn't even come in second in Louisiana's primary system. Cassidy didn't just lose to a single individual. He lost to Letlow and to a Trump, who was the Trump-endorsed U.S. representative, and another John Fleming, a former Trump official. Each of them notched 1 and 2, 44.8% of the vote and 28.3% of the vote, respectively. Cassidy comes in a distant third, 24.8%. So, Justin, as I noted at the top, I think this is just more evidence that the Republicans are the party of MAGA populists, and I think all this talk of distinction is meaningless. But I'm curious about your take.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. That Trump did very well this time. With primary endorsements, pretty much everybody he's endorsed, so far has picked up. And I do think it's interesting, sort of the level of loyalty demanded here. If you look at these folks, and for what it's worth, I mean, Massie and Cassidy, I suppose, are relatively high dissenters, but that still means voting, 90% plus of the time with the president. And to be fair, on the Democratic side, that's kind of the story too. Everybody's mad at John Fetterman, who mostly votes with the Democrats, So, that dissent is largely not tolerated. I will say, for both of these, I think more than individual votes, it is sort of a personal loyalty, personal vendetta kind of thing. With Cassidy casting a vote for impeachment, with Massie, not just, dissenting occasionally, but dissenting on big stuff. He had voted against the big, beautiful bill. He had voted against kind of the COVID stimulus money back, years ago. He had push to unseal the Epstein files. So these are the kinds of things that are really going to get you in on the bad side of the president. But he does apparently have the juice, electorally with the Republican base to do this. And I mean, it is worth noting, I don't know that so far there's been sort of an unusually high number of sitting House members or senators losing primaries, but that's really unusual. I mean, those don't happen very often, and it is like a national story, when it does. So, these two, I mean, I think they are, to the extent that you could be an iconoclast at this point, they are iconoclasts within the party. And I think it just shows, Trump can sort of enforce his will.
That's a really important point. I wasn't even really thinking about that data, but I teach a Congress class, and one of the things that just blows students' minds is when you look at the actual incumbent reelection data in the modern time, it's almost flawless, right? And so when you say that, I think sometimes we're kind of thinking like sports teams. Oh, they made it to the finals twice or something. No. When we're talking about this, we're talking about. It is so rare that an incumbent just loses to the opposite party that
it's like a 90% retention rate in the general.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we were looking at it's 98% right
Holy
now.
Cow.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, that is a folks that seek re-election, so it could be slightly, folks that might see a hard one coming, might bow out gracefully. But
absolutely,
that's still an impressive number. I mean, that's better than being the Chiefs. That's
yeah, exactly. And so, again, I think we don't always think about that. So to have this many lose at the primary level, meaning they are in fact trying, is unusual. Now, the other thing that I did look up some data for, because this is something that I do talk about, but you don't always get to it. But there has been a lot of, you pointed out it's the high profile votes that potentially get Massey and Cassidy in trouble. But their percentages, even though they're high, right? Both of those gentlemen are in the low 90%. That actually today is low. So I was taking a look at this data historically. The high point of having what you might call bipartisanship emerges in the late 1960s into the 1970s, where you get about 63 to 72% of party line votes taking place in Congress. So in other words, you've got a significant amount of dissent. If you take a look at this past year, not this year, but if you take a look at 23 through 25 right now, you're at just a scooch over 96% of all votes are party line votes. And so, I mean, and that's something to be thoughtful about here. Yeah, Massey and Cassidy, they're voting a lot, but they're not voting as much as their colleagues. And that is a shift in American congressional behavior.
Yeah, there's a great video I like to show in class from Business Insider, but it's a bunch of red and blue dots, and it shows kind of how often the pairs vote together. It's for each Congress from the 50s through, I think it ends in like 2012 or something like that. It's a slightly older video, but it makes this point really well, because you get all of this kind of, party always mattered. I mean, it means something to be a Republican, means something to be a Democrat, but, you get this kind of cloud where there's some overlap and things like that. And as it goes on, you get these two, I'm using my hands in this audio format, but you get this basically a red cloud and a blue cloud, and occasionally there'll be somebody who's very lost in the middle, but that's about it. And that's kind of a 90s kind of Newt Gingrich Contract with America Forward thing, is where it was splitting before, splits hard there. But I think we're more so now, if you were to continue that video. I mean, I think there's, so little dissension at this point.
Yeah. I mean, you're at 4 or under % of dissension across an entire Congress,
which is just wild, and I will say a little bit of that past bipartisanship, some of the 60s stuff is a little less touchy-feely when you look at it, because a lot of it is civil rights stuff where the parties were not essentially on civil rights, you were sorted by region rather than party. So, Northern Democrats were generally pro civil rights. Southern Democrats were turning fire hoses on black kids. And same for Republicans. Republicans like to say, oh, it's the Democrats that did all this stuff. Yeah. If you're a Republican from Alabama, you were a bastard on that stuff too. So some of that bipartisanship is that, I think. And if you were to purge out that, but still.
Well, and I think the American system in some ways assumed that there would be regionality and not party sorting, right? So, for example, Ken and I have been going through the Federalist Papers, and there's this idea that there's going to be this regionality to voting. But what we see in what we call the modern era of voting for political scientists means that we move away from that kind of hyper location being the primary determinant of these kinds of issues, and rather it being, ideological assignment in that sense is maybe the easiest way to understand that.
And I've always kind of grappled with that, in the Federalist, because I was going to go Federalist Papers and then you did, but hey, we're here. So, there are lines in there like, well, of course somebody from Massachusetts and somebody from Connecticut want different things. There's an idea that they're, that the state identity is very strong. I have always wondered if some of that wasn't a proxy for ideology, on some level.
For sure. I wouldn't disagree
but they
with
don't
you.
ever use the word ideology, in there. But this idea of interest being grouped that way. I will say, there is still some regionality to it, in the sense if we look at voting patterns and things like that, South is definitely different from the Northeast, and Minnesota's a Midwestern outlier, and things like that. On the other hand, certainly there are these sort of cross-cutting things, absolutely, and I think the big shift there is that the parties have really sorted along those lines in a very successful way. To stick up for it a little, and it pains me, but, at least, as a voter, you kind of know what you're getting. You have a consistent brand within the parties, and if you pick the R, you're going to get a certain set of politics. If you pick the D, you're going to get the other set of politics. So, there is a clarifying business there, but from a governance standpoint, it's highly problematic, I think. Frankly, for people more in the middle, I'm sure they feel, rather left out at this point. So.
Now, there's no research on this, but I have long thought it'd be worth investigating. So I'm curious, let's get down the political science hole for a second on this.
Yeah, let's shoot some hypotheses here.
I have thought, because I am one of my areas is I'm a communication scholar, political communication scholar. I have wondered if there hasn't been a connection between the fact that we now have a homogenization of media over time. We see this, for example, there is research done on the communication side. I was talking with my communication scholars. The kind of the linguistic dialect differences are eroding over time, right? So there's less and less linguistic differences over larger and larger areas. And again, I'm just kind of bringing that in as a side point. I have often wondered if maybe there aren't similar things that take place politically speaking as regionality plays less of a role because we've flattened the world, right? And so the things that we're talking about are larger, more cross-cutting. We talk more the similar. We watch those kinds of things. And anymore, even the kinds of pushback that I've gotten on that hypothesis to say, okay, well, on social media, you can kind of have these kinds of echo chambers. But the answer is, but those echo chambers are not based on the traditional things we're thinking about. Mm-hmm. They're based on engagement, meaning that you might be seeing the same things that other hyper-engaged people in California, Iowa, Massachusetts, and Atlanta are seeing. I've often wondered if there might not be some kind of deregionalization by the fact that we have, students don't even think about those things the same way we might have in, say, the 1990s, not because they're different fundamentally as persons, because we've changed the landscape in which they exist. Do you think that there's any legs to that? I've never seen any research on that, though.
It's like when my kid asked me what kind of iPad I had when I was growing up. They just, the youth today, I like them, but they can't relate. I've often said that, for communication reasons, not maybe going to the extent that quite in the direction that you have, but I think there's something there. But that region matters a lot less. Locality reality matters a lot less. And this starts, I think, in the mass media era. And I think actually, looping in that, linguistic differences bit is important, because, that was sort of a flattening. And, interestingly, it was largely sort of Midwesterners that they picked to be, broadcasters, because we are mutually intelligible,
Yep.
in a way that, some guy from Brooklyn is not going to be understood in South Carolina, and vice versa. Apparently Kansans go everywhere, more or less, can be understood. But I do think, place is less important. And I do think, to the extent that we can get really nichey, and this is something I've talked about with my students a lot, that I think, and it is like, the old man yells at cloud a little bit, but
My favorite. I love the Weekend Simpsons together.
But it is, I have to, like, I'm talking history from not that long ago, but that's just completely foreign to them, but we don't have those same shared understandings that we had sort of in the broadcast era. But we do share in different ways. And these niches, I think you're right, generally transcend location. You see things like, people in the North with Confederate flags and things like that, you same around here a little bit, we weren't part of the Confederacy, and yet,
What?
take it. Yeah. And I don't think it's just because they're Skinnerd fans. It is, it's sending a message. And so I do think that, we do have this kind of ideological, stuff that sort of transcends, state lines, at least. I will say there is a bit, where regionality, I think, still exists to an extent, is kind of the urban-rural divide, which is certainly, being in Iowa is definitely on my mind. And
But to be honest, that only continues to exist not because there's not homogenization going on, because today we continue to get more and more urban all the time, right?
right.
But rather because we have an electoral system that doesn't allow those shifts in population to be felt in the actual voting process.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And there's a great book from, I don't know, probably 15 years ago. It's called The Big Sort by Bill Bishop, who I think he's a sociologist, maybe. And it was kind of a popular press book a little bit, but sort of talking about people, kind of moving regionally for political reasons, or at least lifestyle reasons. And I think some of that's a little overblown. I've got people in the family that are like, oh, I'm leaving Illinois any day now because I hate the politics here, and I'll be darned if they're not still there. But there is sort of that, and I think some of that is he talks about it more, I think, in terms of state movement, is my recollection, but kind of that.
Yeah,
urban...
he's a little more micro. It's in terms of where you are in those enclaves, I believe,
but
if
I'm
recalling that properly.
Teaching college, for example, we are kind of a pipeline from, we are UNI is a school that draws a lot of rural students in. And, when I go around the room.
Oh, very much so.
When I go around the room and ask, hey, where are you from? And, half of them are places I've never heard of. And occasionally I can drop one that blows their mind, because I've been to, a fair number of little places as well. I have distant relatives in Sway City, Iowa, population 432. But it is kind of a pipeline. They end up in Des Moines, or they end up in Minneapolis, or, what have you. And so, I think there is that sort of movement, as well. I wondered maybe if we could talk just for a second as we wrap this up, thinking about kind of, to pivot back to where we started a little bit with the elections. What do you think this means for the sort of future of the Republican Party in a post-Trump world? So a couple weeks ago, Mike and I were on with Kirby Goidel from Texas A&M, and that was a question we engaged with a little bit. He's actually got a book coming out dealing with that as well in a couple weeks. But what do does this give a sense to you? Does this sort of end with Trump, or has he, do you think, sort of remade the party to the point where this is just who they're going to be?
Well, I think in normal times there would be an opportunity. Well, in other presidents, as they have kind of come to the end of their second term, have not made these kinds of pushes because they're more interested in getting things passed than they are in having kind of party level purity that you might want earlier on in your terms, right? And so Trump is behaving a little atypically there on that front.
Really?
I know, it's a shock.
Trump atypical, I can't imagine.
But I think the other one that neither analysts or other scholars have really taken seriously is whether you think he does it or not. Trump is behaving as if he's going to seek a third term. And I think it's a mistake analytically to say that he's just bloviating about that, because generally when Trump bloviates about things, there are truths there, right? And Jay often will say, well, you've got to kind of understand the words behind the words, and we laugh at him. And I think there's a rightfulness to which there is a rightfulness to which we should be a little bit poking at Jay when he makes that. But on the other hand, there's also a truth to what Jay is saying. What I want to mean by that is that you have to take Trump's comment seriously, especially the ones that he keeps putting out over and over again. And so I think it's going to be, I think it's going to be very difficult for there to be a post-Trump making, because Trump, whether he does it or not, so I'm not making a prediction about him trying to actually do it, whether he does it or not, he is going to operate for the last years of his term as if he would run again. He's not going to let a Marco Rubio or somebody else start stealing the spotlight, and he's not going to suddenly endorse that man, a year out in a camp. It's not going to happen. And so, no, I think in the medium term, the Republican Party is a MAGA populist party because you can't get out of the shadow of Trump. It'll take at least an election. It will take at least 1 to 2 election cycles to see what a post-Trump world will look like, because again, he's operating as if he's going to have a third term.
That does raise an interesting sort of thing. I hadn't really pondered, but I'm skeptical that Trump actually runs for a third term, but I agree that he's behaving.
I hear that, yeah.
But I think you're right. I mean, he is in permanent campaign mode, and for somebody that has, bottom of the barrel popularity, like he's still trying to cultivate approval. But I do wonder, yeah, gosh, thinking about 2028, like, how do you run a campaign when he's still in office? Because usually, that president kind of they'll endorse and step back a little bit, perhaps, in the election, especially during that lame duck final year, the election becomes the political story. But I don't know if Trump will let that happen.
I can't imagine that he would. I mean, in what other circumstance have we seen that occur? I mean, even if we talked about, or Ken and I talked about a few weeks ago, even in those local Indiana elections, he was going to get involved, right?
Yeah.
And so why would we think that he's going to suddenly be different when it comes to a Vance or a Rubio or, fill in the blank?
The other thing where I think, MAGA perhaps has some legs is on the socialization side. So thinking about, I mean, gosh, you could be pushing 30 and the only Republican politics are MAGA. At this point.
Look at Congress. There are there will now be pre-Trump Republicans after the upcoming election.
Right. And so I do wonder, just as the base of the party as well, and I'm not sure I'm not sure that you can continue building a winning coalition out of that, I think at some point, the parties recalibrate a little bit, but I do have some suspicions here that may be where some of this has some legs too, is just that, 20-year-old doesn't have any idea who Newt Gingrich is at this point. And gosh, we thought he was a radical at the time. So, I think that may be kind of some of the other legacy of this, but I do think at some point, probably without Trump to hold it together, the wheels come off, most likely. But
the wheels coming off Trump and the underlying populism.
I don't think it goes back to the old Republican Party.
Yeah, exactly. I'm with you.
But I do think that, he is kind of the glue that holds this all together. And I do wonder if the party doesn't maybe go into the weeds a little bit after him without a kind of figurehead. I don't think JD Vance has the charisma. I don't think Little Marco has the charisma. I don't know who. God forbid it's Tucker Carlson. But anyhow.
But, Tucker Carlson would be the right kind of character. But I do want us to move to another story. It doesn't completely move us away. But now, Tuesday morning, the DOJ published a pretty extraordinary one-page document. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche noted that it was, and remember, this is the president's personal defense lawyer just about 4 seconds ago, signed an addendum that officially declares the United States government is, quote, forever barred and precluded, end quote, from ever auditing or pursuing tax claims against Donald Trump or his family or his business partners ever. That's right. I'm not exaggerating, not teasing. That's what it does. Now, this historic concession, though, is attached to a settlement resolving a $10 billion lawsuit Trump filed against the IRS over the unauthorized leak of his tax data by a contractor. Now, Trump won't take a personal cash payout, and here's where things get a little different. Instead, he effectively gets a 1.776. Friend, it's got to be on 1776. Come on. We all know. Anyway, it's 1776 payout. That's right. 1.776 billion dollar into what is a newly created anti-weaponization fund. So, what's the purpose of this fund? Well, when pressed this week in Senate committee about who qualifies for this weird taxpayer-funded payout, Blanche openly testified that there are no limitations on the funds, and that means, importantly, that it includes and might even be directed more specifically towards individuals who are part of the Capitol riots, attacks, and insurrection, including those individuals who assaulted police officers on January 6th. So, there's a lot to talk about there. And it's funny to me, when I was prepping for the story, Justin, I couldn't help but go back. It was right after one of my surgeries, our local Channel 4. I don't know if this happens to you, but they'll come and be like, hey, can you give us a political angle on something? They want somebody, especially when it's, they don't want to make an opinion.
I don't get it a lot because there's somebody more handsome in the department that can do it in my place.
See, I am a department of one.
So you are the most handsome in your department. I got a face made for podcasting, but
hey, listen, it's all good. It's all good. And so I had just had that interview. I had just had the surgery, so I couldn't actually make it to their studio, but they were desperate enough. They actually came to my house to do it. And so we got me propped up, sort of, kind of. And they asked me, the interviewer was asking me, he's like, look, do you think that Trump is going to pardon everybody for Jan 6? And I said, yes. And he's like, are you sure? Yes. So we talked for a little bit. And then after the tape stopped, the digital tape, as we say today, stopped rolling, I'm starting to lay back down a little bit because I can't sit up the whole time. That's where my surgery was. And he said, I'm just curious, right? Cameras are off. I'm like, are you trying to be bombastic? There's no way this is going to happen, right? You're not honestly making this prediction. And I said, I'm honestly telling you, as a scholar and an observer of what's going on, he's going to pardon them all. As a matter of fact, as a result of that, he's moved up now. I'm the morning show political analysis now because he did. And so later he texts him. He's like, you were right. You're right about everything. Now, I'll be clear. I'm not right about everything, friends, but
let him think that. Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to be our spokesperson for the local media here.
Yeah.
It gets us all kind of ads, but free ads. But the takeaway for me, though, is I can't say that this is both shocking but not shocking, right? It's not shocking to me that Trump would see in his office would see something like this. But of course it is. That doesn't make it any less of a big deal. So I'm curious. I mean, this is over $1 billion. What's your thought on the 1776 fund, Justin? Where do you think this goes?
Well, sir, I don't like it. Yeah, this is like one of the most corrupt things I think I've ever seen. And Trump, I mean, that 10 billion, that is his standard lawsuit. He sued the BBC for $10 billion and, a couple other entities for $10 billion.
I'm not teasing. Do you think he watched like some movies where bad guys sued people and went, $10 billion? That's like, it feels a little.
One of my favorite parts of the first Austin Power movie is he doesn't account for inflation. $1 million. But yeah. So I don't know. I mean, it's just a big honking number, to use, technical jargon. But I think this one where all of those have been laughed out of court, and I think, here I will say, to stick up for him slightly, and this hurts, but, he does have a grievance over the leak of the tax returns. On the other hand, that person was punished by the Biden administration, I might add. So, there goes your weaponization claims, I think. But I mean, there is potentially some grievance here. There's absolutely not $10 billion worth of grievance. But the bigger problem here, as you've kind of alluded to, is that, he's both sides of this. You're making...
He's the plaintiff and the defendant.
And
with his own personal attorney
as the opposition. And I mean, presumably a judge still needs to sign off on this, and I'm sure they can find someone who will, but I mean, this is just
the judge wouldn't necessarily have to sign off on it. But now, what is already happening, and I wanted to bring that in.
Yeah,
we already have 2 Capitol Police officers who are suing over this, which will bring it before judges in a different kind of context,
right?
And in part, just for individuals to know. I mean, the reason this is even a bigger constitutional question. Many constitutional scholars, as a matter of fact, Representative Raskin, who himself is a former constitutional law professor, have pointed to the 14th Amendment. And that is, in fact, the basis on which the 2 Capitol Police officers are suing. They're arguing that it's a violation of the 14th Amendment, specifically Section 4. It says in part, quote, "Neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt or obligation incurred in aid of insurrection or rebellion against the United States, but all such debts, obligations, and claims shall be held illegal and void," end quote. Now, originally, of course, this was designed in the wake of the Civil War to prevent the U.S. government from paying off Confederate war bonds or compensating slave owners for emancipation. But there's this really famous Supreme Court case. Matter of fact, I teach it in my con law class, Perry versus the United States back in 1956. And it says, look, even though the intention is originally the Civil War, there's what they call broader connotations beyond the end of the Civil War. And so, I mean, that's what's coming up, and that's going to come before a judge.
Right.
But I mean, the decision of the DOJ itself doesn't have to come from a judge because it's a settlement.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, it's, geez. But, I think that's problematic. The audit business, I think, is, and I'm a little unclear from this, if this is, only audits of things up to date, or if this is, in perpetuity for the future of everything that they might do, which, gosh, giving those guys carte blanche for tax evasion is not great. But I think this is, there's several problems here, as well. A column in the New York Times this week pointed out, a couple things with this. One, by law, the president gets audited every year, and we've done this for every president. And so, what does that do to this? But the other is, that the IRS is not allowed to stop audits on behalf of the president. The president does not have the power to stop anybody from being audited. And, certainly this, I mean, it's not a direct presidential order, but it's part of a settlement between the president and himself, essentially. So, I think there are some questions, some serious questions there as well. But I think, the bottom line, this whole thing is just nuts, to use.
But now I want to be careful, because I think, our show anymore has tended to skew demographically a little bit. This will be more popular than I think many people realize, right? So if you were to walk around in my world, come to Oklahoma, I bet you it's true in Iowa too, although, I don't walk around in Iowa. But if you came and walk
It's a long
around,
walk.
You walk around in Oklahoma, you walk around and ask people, you're going to get some variation of, sure, there were a few bad actors on Jan 6, and there were some agitators from the Biden administration. And again, I'm not making this as my own claim. I'm just
No.
and,
I'm well aware of this argument. Yeah, but continue.
And so, yeah, there's a bunch of really good people. As a matter of fact, you'll be surprised how many people oh, I know, like my aunt or my whatever was there on Jan 6, and she did nothing wrong and it was just fine. And, I mean, again, for some people that very well could be the case. There were people who were there, doing things that didn't march on the Capitol, for example. But be that as it may, it doesn't matter. They're going to view this as a really positive thing. And in the same way that I find it kind of hilarious that it's 1776, friends, that's going to be a popular point of view. I can't tell you, we've talked about on the show before. I love to go down to the range. I love to shoot. But I can't tell you how many weapons people have that are like covered in the flag or 1770 or all these kind of things, or have like Trump's face on it or whatever. And again, it sounds like I'm teasing, and I'm not. I'm being dead serious with you, friends. I think this will actually be more popular among some than many people realize. And I think to dismiss it, and I don't mean dismiss, I think it ought to be dismissed as being bad. I agree with you. However, I think politically it's going to be easy for individuals to look at this and go, the whole world recognizes this is terrible. I disagree.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right. I mean, it is, and I think a lot of this, is just, it's the continued narrative that, I am being persecuted. If they can come after me, just imagine what they can do to you, sort of thing. And no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it is an article of faith among a very large proportion of MAGA that, 2020 was stolen. January 6th is sort of, Schrodinger's insurrection. It's either justified or Nancy Pelosi's fault, depending
or
on what's
it didn't really
convenient.
exist, right? The actual insurrectionists were placed agents, right? I mean, that is a very popular view.
Well, I've absolutely seen it. You're spot on. So, I do think in an overall context, I mean, I think this is people are mostly going to be honked off about it, but that 35% of the public is going to be all in, on that. I mean, that's about, mid 30s seems to be kind of the hardcore red hat owning portion of America. So yeah, I mean, I think it really shores up with the base. That 1776 thing is just, I find that just incensing. I mean, it's for so many reasons. But yeah, I agree with you there, that, this is not going to be completely, again, back to kind of our first segment. I mean, it is kind of maintenance of the MAGA movement on some level. And I will say, to be fair, I don't know the exact percentage, but, there were quite a few people on January 6th that were just at a protest, and that's not
Absolutely.
a problem. I don't have a
Absolutely.
problem with that. It's certainly, entirely possible that, you were there and didn't do anything wrong. But we have pretty good documentation that there were some people there that did some pretty wrong stuff. Now, whether or not that rises to the level of insurrection, which that came up, back in 24, a couple states tried to keep Trump off the ballot, using kind of that same 14th Amendment insurrection language, and it didn't really go anywhere. So, I don't know. It's one of those constitutional moments where, an asterisk with a definition in the footnotes would be really handy, and by insurrection, we mean this. Because, yeah, I agree with you that it extends beyond the Civil War, but knowing it kind of lacks a legal definition.
Very much so it does. And that's a problem.
Which is a problem, which is, one of my consistent gripes with the Constitution is, God, what I wouldn't give for a footnote right there, to solve a lot of our problems.
But of course, to be honest for a second, one of the reasons we don't have those footnotes is that language is helpful for passing things, right?
Yeah.
The flexibility of it is what allows more than one person to read in something and ergo be in favor of it. And so there are portions of the Constitution that were purposefully, compromisingly unfootnoted. Let's put it
Oh,
that
and this
way.
is a bullet point on my how did the Constitution last this long slide? Is that we leave enough flexibility that we didn't have to expand the Commerce Clause to deal with online commerce and things like that because James Madison never thought about Robux. But I think on some of the procedural stuff, it would be really handy to have some degree of definition. I think, just as wrapping up sort of my thoughts on this, the other thing is just that, this lawfare business, I mean, these are all people presumably that have been convicted through a process. I mean, it's unclear exactly who is, going to partake in this. But it is people, this is not people who were just sort of hounded by prosecutors and things like that, which is more the Trump MO where, he sues all kinds of people and, it gets laughed out of court fairly early, but not after, hundreds of thousands of dollars legal fees and, ulcers and things like that. But, these were people that were convicted by and large, and so I think it's really hard to say
Or in
here
some
that they
cases, more than once, right? We have individuals who are convicted and then they're caught with additional weapons later, violating their terms of parole.
surprising number of child molesters among J6ers. I mean, not all of them, but the number that have gone down for child pornography and things like that afterwards is sort of shocking. But even, setting aside the recidivism or just other generally bad acts, we have a legal process and they went through the legal process and they lost. I mean, this is not sort of capricious, and so I think that's sort of the other element here is that, what grievance do these folks really have? I mean, sometimes you do bad things and you get a trial and you lose and you get in trouble. I mean, that's just sort of how this stuff works.
Well, that's fair, but I think we'll pause it there to move
Yeah, it's
on and
time.
get a couple more stories. And Justin, the other one I want to move to, let's head over to the Senate, where the Trump administration had at least a symbolic loss on Tuesday in a 50-47 vote. The Senate voted to advance a war powers resolution specifically aimed at forcing President Trump to halt all military operations in Iran unless he receives an explicit authorization from Congress. Now, this is the 8th vote since the war began in February, but all previous attempts were killed by Republicans. Now, what changed? Well, one of them, as we talked about at the beginning, fresh off his primary defeat over the weekend, Cassidy walked onto the floor and voted with Democrats to advance the measures, along with some other anti-interventionists, including Rand Paul, Susan Collins, and Lisa Murkowski. Now, to be clear, this again is symbolic. And, it didn't seem possible that the House Republicans would allow it to pass. Well, until it did. Late Thursday, House Republicans ended up denying a vote on the war powers resolution. In the House, this doesn't appear to be a major walk back from the president, but as House Majority Leader Scalise pointed out, quote, "We just had some members that weren't there for it who wanted to be recorded on it," end quote. And that is in fact true. So this gives them until after their return from the Memorial Day recess. And it's really deeply unlikely the House is going to vote for this. But even if, with Massey and others who'd already voted for it before, somebody else crosses over, that's not going to give Trump a lot of second thoughts because, of course, he can break this by a veto. Now, I have heard a lot of commentators. As a matter of fact, this morning, Friday morning on NPR, everybody was arguing like this was some kind of seismic shift and that the earth was moving and that Congress was re-exerting a backbone and going to, stop the president from doing things. Again, the president can and he will still veto this bill. But I don't think the House is going to vote for it. I think more what this signals is that there's a few Republicans in certain districts that are worried about the electoral toll of the Iran war and want to be able to take a vote on it so that they can do it that way. Again, cost $29 billion, gas, a little over $4.50. They want to take a vote on that. That's all that's going on here. All this other talking class blovation on how this signals something large have somehow 24-hour memory loss over what just happened in these elections, primary elections. I don't know. What's your take on this?
About the same. I think it is, feel like we're hitting this theme repeatedly today, but it is, I think, a little striking to have much of any votes against it. On one level, just given the level of party discipline that we have at this point, to have any Republicans crossing over to vote for this. On the one hand, I mean, that is vaguely notable. I mean, especially on a big ticket sort of item like this. On the other hand, it was still pretty darn close to a straight party line vote. This is not that much dissent. So it's not really showing any giant cracks in the MAGA Republican coalition in that regard. I do think it might affect the optics a little bit. I mean, you are getting these commentators that are saying this, and there is something to be said, especially for people that aren't paying a whole lot of attention. When you can say something was bipartisan, and it was not very, but it is, it's technically correct, the best kind of correct. It's
and a Futurama fan too. It's all coming out today.
It's all coming out today. So I don't even think of it in those terms. These have just pervaded my lexicon at this point. But I think you can at that point. You can make a little hay out of that. That there was this bipartisan vote, even if it's not meaningfully bipartisan. But yeah, on procedural grounds, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is going nowhere. Even if it did pass in the House, there's obviously a veto here. I mean, no president is probably going to tie his own hands with something like this, if it ever came to a vote. So, there's that, and there's certainly nowhere near a veto override kind of majority for this. I mean, it would pass by the skin of its teeth. Of course, the other thing here, is that Trump has just been so cagey with this stuff anyway. If you remember, was it last week, 2 weeks ago, we've ended that operation and started a new one. So, it's now day 0, not day 60, kind of
Well,
stuff.
or we were paused for a while, says Vance.
So those days don't count.
And those days don't count towards the clock.
So, I think this is a whole lot of nothing, but I do agree that I think there are some Republicans that are concerned about sort of paying a price here, and I think, it's not going to be many of them. And the war is, I guess, not technically war, but whatever's happening is not very popular. On the other hand, if we think about
and to be clear, it's not just not popular, but I think it's the one item where it's not popular specifically with that a large portion of that 33% who are normally MAGA. And that's what makes this more tricky for Republicans as they think forward.
So, I will say it is, I mean, there is pretty high Republican support. And now that I say this, I wish I had a number in front of me, but, solid majority support for amongst Republicans, for operations in Iraq. And certainly anecdotally, I see people say, yeah, I'm willing to pay $4.50 for gas, for all the great things that are happening. But, and so I think, for an awful lot of Republicans, this isn't going to hurt them too much. On the other hand, I think some of those swing district folks that are going to be, I mean, this is probably not a great year to be a Republican in a swing district, if I had to guess. And if you are sort of eroding, on this issue, that I will say, folks were wrong in understanding in 24. I mean, Trump, he pitches himself as the president of peace, and people bought that hook, line, and sinker. But he also pretty much threatened Iran, on the campaign trail. I mean, this is not exactly new. But, those folks, I think where, swing district Republicans might have kind of a double whammy is, the Democrats are going to vote against him and seem to have the energy and will come out. But you may have some MAGA Republicans that are pissed off enough to sit this one out. Well, they're not going to go Democratic, but.
While you're looking at it, I popped up the data, friend.
I saw you doing that, so I kept talking about you Googled.
Yeah, well, you got to love it. So Republican support, taking a look, this is a combination of IGA, Quinnipiac, and the New York Times. And what they have here is you've got the overall decision to go to war. Republican support rests between 79 and 85% of the president's handling of the war. You got 73% approving, 49% strongly. For escalation, for sending troops, you got 37 to 39%. And then on this kind of interesting question, is the Iran war making the United States safer? Again, this is all among Republicans, 55%. So, I mean, again, those are very supportive, but they've got some larger pushback than many other items that we've seen come up, right?
Well, and it's not as
Up to
supportive
almost
of past, if we think about like Iraq, where, I mean, like probably 80% of Americans, not just Republicans, but, I mean, that would have been like 100% Republican support, pretty much. So this is definitely different. And I do think this, potentially causes some headaches for some folks, running for reelection, but I'm not sure that it's fatal to too many of them. But I think,
No.
those that are marginal, I mean, I don't think you're going to have anybody vote for a Democrat to punish them, but we don't talk enough about sort of turnout and abstention when we talk about elections.
Absolutely. That's the big
I
thing
think
you're
that's the
trying to
danger
do.
for Republicans here is that, and it's not going to be all of them, clearly it's only, 20 or 30% are, honked off about this. But if even some fraction of those choose to just, hey, this party gives me nothing, even if they just, I mean, in a close race, that's a problem. So
I agree. Well, let's finish up with a quicker kind of story maybe here, Justin. Another one that's going to focus on Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, i.e. Trump personal lawyer. He unsealed a federal criminal indictment charging 94-year-old former Cuban President Raúl Castro and his 5 co-defendants with conspiracy to kill U.S. nationals, 4 counts of murder, and the destruction of an aircraft. Now, the charges stem back from that amazing decade known as the 1990s. I know you won't disagree with me on that. Specifically, February 24th, 1996, when Cuban military fighter jets under Castro's command shot down 2 unarmed civilian Cessna aircrafts operated by the Miami-based exile humanitarian group Brothers to the Rescue over international waters. And for the last 30 years, it's true, the families of those 4 volunteers killed in the attacks have looked for legal justice. And so I am sure there is solace for those families. And it does seem to be an attempt to have the Trump administration do something for those who have left Cuba. But last week, there had already been reports that the United States had potential plans to attack Cuba. This indictment, along with the military confirming that the USS Nimitz and its escort warships have officially entered the southern Caribbean Sea, potentially point to another conflict. So while on the one hand, I think many of us could be happy with the idea of there being a level of justice for the individuals who were killed, this could be a setup for yet another conflict. And if you think that's not a possibility, Blanche this past week told U.S. reporters that Raul is expected to show up, quote, by his own will or by another way, end quote. And that seems to be a reference to the administration's military capture and extradition of Venezuela leader Nicolas Maduro to a New York prison earlier this year. And so, Justin, what do you think about that? I mean, I do think there's kind of 2 angles to this, and it's kind of hard to separate them out. I mean, on the one hand, this is a terrible human being, again, who did violate international law. I mean, there's no question about that. But it also appears, based on the acting attorney general, to maybe be just more of a pretense than real legal justice. And I'm not sure how to separate that out. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I will say, just from kind of looking into this, I mean, the Cubans, and I don't necessarily buy it, but they dispute that it was in international airspace when it happened. But I suppose that would be easy enough to establish because Cessna doesn't fall.
And as I recall, that was
Cessna
something
doesn't
that had
fall
been
far from where it's
established.
shot down.
I don't think there's
just throwing
a lot
that
of
out there
legs
as
to
some
that,
added.
yeah.
There is a little dispute about that, but yeah, I mean, I don't see a scenario where Castro surrenders. And I don't see a
What, he
scenario
doesn't
where-
hop on the next flight to Miami and turn himself over to federal prosecutors? I'm shocked.
Yeah, bring a box of cigars for goodwill. But I don't see that. I absolutely don't see the Cuban government as extraditing him. He's not in power, but there is at least some speculation that kind of behind the scenes he's still kind of in power. So I don't see that. I'm inclined to think, you kind of beat me to the punch a little bit, but yeah, I'm strongly inclined to think this is a pretense of, some sort of military action. I mean, Trump has been threatening even before as you point out, and not just last week, but for quite a while now, has been threatening, military action against Cuba. I'm not sure that a 30-year-old, I mean, yeah, it's wrong. Don't shoot down civilian airplanes, and don't be a dictator, and so on. But I'm not sure.
Violate international law,
I mean, these are goes without saying kinds of things. On the other hand, 30 years on, like, I don't see any reason. I don't really see a reason that you would prosecute of all the things you could be doing, a 30-year-old incident. It strikes me as, just prosecuting it on its merits seems pretty unlikely. It really feels like sort of a pretense to pull a Maduro sort of situation here, and do an extraction and maybe inflict more damage on the Cubans. For what it's worth, some of the guards that were killed in Venezuela were Cuban, as well. So there's kind of that connection. I suppose the other angle for this is that, to a large extent, I felt like Trump's politics are largely stuck in the past on a lot of issues. And this just feels like kind of him relitigating the Cold War would be maybe another angle on this. But, if we're looking around, I mean, Venezuela is new, but Cuba and Iran, I mean, these are like the greatest hits of the 80s and the 60s and, things like that. And Cuba has been a perennial thorn in our side, I suppose, psychologically as much as anything, just having sort of a communist and at the time Soviet aligned regime, 90 miles off of Miami. Certainly that'll do something to your head. And, America has done a lot of dumb stuff with regard to Cuba, whether it's the Bay of Pigs or various Fidel assassination attempts or things like that are things that you wouldn't believe if they were in a movie, for being so far-fetched. So I feel like this is on some level with Trump, just trying to, I want to solve this problem that JFK couldn't solve, kind of thing. After Fidel is dead, and Raúl is 1 foot in the grave at this point. So
Yeah, I mean, the other commonality here is, in Iran before the attack and right now in Cuba, Cuba's been buckling under that severe U.S. oil embargo. I mean, they've got rolling blackouts. They've got probably some of the largest popular major unrest going on in Cuba right now that they have in a long time. And we saw something similar in Iran. Another possible read on this is that in both cases, Trump, in maybe a more hand-fisted kind of way, thought he was going to be the liberator of Iran, and so he failed in Iran. Now maybe I can make up for it and be the liberator of Cuba. But I think it's more likely that we'll see the same kind of thing happen, where if you do something like that, it's going to squash these protests. It's going to go the other direction, and you're going to have a bigger kind of military crackdown.
I think that's always the danger. And frankly, I mean, the U.S., I think, has, and it may be different now, but I think for a long time, the U.S. has sort of underestimated regime support there. If you go back to, I mean, granted, this is ancient history, but, if you go back to the Bay of Pigs, they thought, we can march 2,000, irregulars through Cuba, and everybody's just going to rise up and, overthrow Castro. And that didn't happen, clearly.
Yeah.
So it's harder to say now because obviously we're not going to get good polling data out of Cuba. But it seems unlikely to me that, and as you say, and this is something I've harped on for a while, is that, it's a great way to unify a country to invade them, to liberate them. Time and again, if anything makes you support a regime you don't like, it's an attack from the outside. And so I think,
well, it's the old family issue, right? My brother and I can have a fight, but you better as heck better not take a side in that fight, because then we're both going to be angry at you. right?
Yes. Or the psychological concept of entitativity, which I won't even try to spell, but, basically how groupy do you see yourself and other groups, and who do you see as part of your group? And, you can see fracture within a national identity up until somebody attacks you. And then, it's, suddenly we're us versus them. So.
Absolutely. But I think on that note, Justin, we should probably call it a show.
I think so.
But that does, yeah. So, but we're not done. We're not done. Justin and I, we're going to be doing our midweek show. Yeah, just wait, there's more. I got to think of what would be the right Simpsons quote for, but wait, there's more though.
I don't have a good Simpsons quote for that.
Yeah, see, we got to work on this. Maybe we'll have like an all Simpsons quote show. We're trying to get as many Simpsons and Futurama references into one show.
Challenge accepted.
Worst episode ever. But I still think we should do it. But be that as it may, we truly aren't done, because we have the supporters exclusive midweek show. And Justin and I, we've been going through ideologies. This week, we're going to be getting into environmentalism as a political ideology, which is a lot of fun. It's interesting. Ken and myself, we had done the Constitution. Now we've been going through the Federalist Papers. There's even a Substack for the Federalist Papers as well. So how do you get access to all of that additional content? Well, you got to become a supporter of the show. So it just takes a couple of minutes. Scroll down to the show notes, click on support the show, and about 10 minutes from now, you'll be listening to all of our back catalog on things on the Constitution, on the Federalist Papers, and you can get caught up on all the ideology shows that Justin and I have already done. It just takes a few minutes. If you don't want to do that, though, you can always head to politicsguys.com/support, or you can head to patreon.com/politicsguys and support us there. There's so many other things you get, including ad-free versions of the shows. But you also get cool things like if you sign up for a whole year, you get discounts. You can sign up free for like a month. It's just amazing things there. So again, head to politicsguys.com/support, or just head down to the show notes and click on support. If you aren't in a financial place to support the show right now, you can reach out to me at mail@politicsguys.com, and we can get you set up with that, because we understand that. Again, I get it for sure. It's always helpful, though, if you would subscribe, rate, review, and even more importantly, share. If you found something interesting about what Justin and I did in this episode, sharing that episode with others is really a big deal. It's the way that we get more supporters and we get other people to listen to the show. And so we really deeply appreciate that. We also deeply appreciate our executive producers. Blows me away every time I think about it, talk about it, log in and meet with them, what they do for the show. And here they are. We've got Wilmer Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, Jody Marie Miller, and Sean Fugit. We'll be back with a new show. Well, either a supporters exclusive show on Tuesday or a full show next week. I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,